The rusted shovel blade scraped against something that wasn't earth, something smooth, deliberate, buried with intention. Thomas Hartwell's weathered hands trembled as he brushed away 4 years of accumulated soil, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a wooden box, and carved into its surface a date that made his blood run cold: June 15, 2021, the day they all disappeared. 4 years. 4 years since the Blackwood estate had been anything more than a monument to unanswered questions, its manicured gardens now wild with neglect, its grand ballroom sealed behind police tape that had long since faded in the mountain sun. Thomas had been the groundskeeper then, had watched 127 wedding guests arrive in their finest attire, laughing and chattering about the perfect mountain weather, the stunning venue, the fairy tale romance of Elena Marchetti and David Crane. He had also been the only one to walk away. June 15, 2021, 6:47 p.m. The reception had been everything Elena dreamed of. White roses cascaded from crystal chandeliers, string quartet music drifted across the stone terrace, and the golden hour light painted everything in warm honey. She moved through her guests like a queen, her vintage lace gown trailing behind her, David's hand never leaving the small of her back. "I can't believe we actually did it," she whispered to him during their first dance, her dark eyes shining with tears of joy. David spun her gently, his own eyes reflecting something deeper, relief, perhaps, or was it desperation? "I told you everything would be perfect, Elena. Trust me." She had trusted him. She'd trusted him when he insisted on this remote venue, 3 hours from the nearest town. She'd trusted him when he'd handled all the catering arrangements personally, when he'd insisted on hiring his own security team, when he'd asked all guests to surrender their phones for a truly unplugged celebration. But Elena Marchetti had always been trusting. It was both her greatest virtue and, as her sister Maria had often warned, her most dangerous flaw. Maria stood at the edge of the dance floor, champagne flute untouched in her manicured fingers, watching her sister with the intensity of a guardian angel. At 28, she was 2 years older than Elena but carried herself with the worldliness of someone who'd learned early that fairy tales were often just nightmares in disguise. She didn't trust David Crane. Never had. There was something too polished about his charm, too rehearsed about his devotion. The way he'd swept Elena off her feet 6 months after her messy divorce, the way he'd isolated her from old friends, the way he'd convinced her to move across the country to start fresh. Maria had done her research. David's previous engagement had ended mysteriously, his ex-fiancée simply vanishing from her apartment one night, leaving behind only a note about needing space. But when Maria had tried to share her concerns, Elena had accused her of jealousy, of being unable to accept her happiness. So Maria had come to the wedding with a smile plastered on her face and a private investigator's business card hidden in her purse. She would never get the chance to use it. Present day, the discovery the box Thomas unearthed was larger than he'd initially thought, nearly 3 feet long, carved from what appeared to be expensive mahogany. His arthritic fingers worked at the brass clasps, corroded but still functional. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather journal and a collection of items that made his stomach lurch: wedding rings, a torn piece of lace, a cell phone, and at the bottom, a USB drive labeled in Elena's careful handwriting. "If you're reading this, then David's plan worked." Thomas's mind raced back to that night, to the moments before everything went wrong. He'd been in the maintenance shed, checking the generator, when he'd heard the first scream. By the time he'd run to the main house, an eerie silence had fallen over the estate. The ballroom doors were locked from the inside. Every window was sealed. And when the police finally arrived, called by Thomas himself, they found nothing but empty rooms, abandoned champagne glasses, and 127 missing persons. The official investigation had lasted 18 months. Theories ranged from mass kidnapping to elaborate hoax, but no evidence was ever found. No ransom demands. No bodies. No witnesses except for one traumatized groundskeeper whose account of strange sounds and shadows moving wrong was dismissed as shock-induced delusion. With shaking hands, Thomas inserted the USB drive into his laptop. Elena's face appeared on screen, but this wasn't the radiant bride from earlier that day. Her makeup was smeared, her dress torn, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her, Thomas could see the ballroom, but something was wrong with it. The walls seemed to shimmer, the shadows moved independently of their sources, and in the background, guests stood motionless, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting light like animals caught in headlights. "My name is Elena Marchetti," her recorded voice whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. If someone finds this, you need to know what really happened here. David isn't who I thought he was. None of this is what I thought it was. The camera shook as she moved deeper into the ballroom, past her frozen wedding guests. Thomas recognized them all: Elena's college roommates, David's business partners, elderly relatives who'd traveled across the country. They stood like mannequins, breathing but not responding, present but not there. Maria tried to warn me, Elena continued, tears streaming down her face. She found out about David's real family, about the Crane Foundation, about what they do to people like us. They don't just want our money, they want our essence, our memories, our connections to the world. And a wedding. God, a wedding is the perfect gathering. All the people who matter most to someone, all in one place, all celebrating love and trust. And the recording cut off abruptly, replaced by David's voice, calm and pleasant as always. Elena, darling, what are you doing with that camera? When the image returned, Elena was backing away from David, who stood in the ballroom doorway. But David looked different now, his features sharper, his eyes black pits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Behind him, more figures emerged from the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, wearing the faces of people Thomas didn't recognize. You see, my love, David continued, his voice taking on harmonics that made Thomas's teeth ache even through the laptop speakers, there are things older than your human understanding of marriage. Older than your quaint notions of love and commitment. What we've shared here tonight isn't just a wedding, it's a harvest. Elena screamed. The recording ended. The journal entries. Thomas opened Elena's journal with trembling fingers. The entries began weeks before the wedding, documenting Elena's growing unease. May 20th, found Maria's research hidden in my old bedroom at Mom's house. 7 women in the past decade, all engaged to men with connections to the Crane Foundation. All disappeared without a trace. David's been lying about his family's business. June 1st, tried to call off the wedding. David became different. His voice, his eyes. When I tried to leave, I couldn't. The doors wouldn't open for me. My car wouldn't start. It's like the house itself is keeping me here. June 10th, Maria arrived early to help with wedding preparations. She's pretending everything is normal, but I can see the fear in her eyes. She's planning something. She gave me this camera, told me to record everything if anything strange happens. June 15th, 4 p.m., the guests are arriving. I recognize most of them, but some I don't remember inviting. And they all have the same empty look in their eyes. David keeps touching me, and every time he does, I feel something draining away. Like he's slowly erasing me. June 15th, 6:30 p.m., last entry. If someone finds this, know that we fought back. Maria had a plan. She'd been working with others, survivors from other harvestings. They're coming tonight, during the ceremony. Whatever happens, don't let David's family complete their collection. The Crane Foundation has been doing this for generations, moving from town to town, feeding on human connections, growing stronger. The wedding was never about love. It was about luring everyone I care about into one place so they could take us all at once. Present day, the truth unveiled. Thomas closed the journal, his hands shaking. He looked around the abandoned estate, seeing it now with new eyes. The Blackwood Estate hadn't been chosen for its beauty, it had been chosen for its isolation, its history of strange disappearances dating back over a century. He thought about that night, about the sounds he'd heard from the maintenance shed. Not screams of terror, but sounds of battle. Elena and Maria and God knows who else, fighting against something inhuman, something that had been masquerading as David Crane. But if they'd fought back, if there had been others helping them, then where were the bodies? Where was the evidence of struggle? Thomas walked back to where he'd found the box, studying the ground more carefully. The earth here was different, softer, more alive somehow. And as he watched, tiny green shoots began pushing through the soil, growing with unnatural speed. They're still here, he realized. All of them. Not dead, not taken, transformed. The garden itself was the wedding party. Every flower, every tree, every blade of grass was a person who'd attended Elena Marchetti's wedding 4 years ago. The Crane Foundation hadn't harvested their victims, they'd planted them, turned human consciousness into something that could be cultivated, nurtured, controlled. And somewhere in this garden, Elena and Maria were still fighting. Thomas felt a hand on his shoulder and spun around. A young woman stood behind him, her features shifting between familiar and strange. Sometimes she looked like Elena, sometimes like Maria, sometimes like faces he'd glimpsed in old wedding photos. "Thank you," she said, her voice layered with harmonics of every guest who'd attended that night. "For finding us. For listening. But you need to leave now. David's family, they know you've been digging." In the distance, Thomas could see black cars winding up the mountain road toward the estate. The Crane Foundation, coming to relocate their garden before anyone else could discover the truth. "What about you?" Thomas asked. "What about Elena and the others?" The woman who was many smiled sadly. "We're not ready to leave yet. There are more gardens, more harvests. Other families like the Cranes. Someone needs to warn them." She pressed something into his palm, a seed, warm and pulsing with life. "Plant this somewhere safe. Somewhere they'll never think to look. We'll find a way to grow toward the light." Thomas pocketed the seed and ran for his truck, not looking back as the black cars reached the estate. As he drove down the winding mountain road, he could see flames in his rearview mirror, the Crane Foundation covering their tracks, destroying the evidence. But they couldn't destroy what he carried with him. 6 months later, the community garden behind St. Mary's Church had always been Thomas's pride and joy, but this year something extraordinary was happening. The vegetables grew larger and more abundant than ever before. The flowers bloomed out of season. And sometimes, if you listened carefully on quiet evenings, you could hear whispers in the wind, voices sharing warnings about charming strangers and perfect weddings and invitations that came with hidden costs. Elena Marchetti and her wedding party had found a way to grow toward the light. But in mansions and estates across the country, other preparations were underway. Other weddings were being planned. Other families were choosing their venues, trusting their hearts to people who wore familiar faces but cast shadows that moved all wrong. The harvest was never ending. And somewhere in the darkness, David Crane was choosing his next bride.